On the afternoon of July 24th, 1983, a man walking his dog near an airstrip in the One Tree Hill area of Adelaide made a horrendous discovery. The corpse of a young man lay in the bushes, fully clothed and in the early stages of decomposition. The man went to immediately call the police, and it did not take them long to identify the victim. In fact, his abduction had been one of the most highly publicised crimes in Adelaide's recent history. It happened around 6 p.m. on the evening of June 5th, 1983. Richard Kelvin, the 15-year-old son of a local TV personality, had just walked a friend to the bus stop on the corner of O'Connell and Marion Streets, North Adelaide, and was returning home, where dinner waited on the table for him. He was just half a block from home when a car pulled to the sidewalk beside him and someone got out. Richard was dragged into the vehicle, which then sped off. People living near the scene later recalled the teenagers' frantic calls for help, the sound of car doors slamming and the roar of the vehicle, which may have had a damaged muffler. An immediate search was launched for Richard Kelvin, but as the weeks went by with no sign of him, hope began to fade that he would ever be found alive. So it had tragically proved, but the discovery of the corpse left police with a mystery to clear up. Richard had obviously been dead for only a couple of days. Where had he been during the interceding weeks? The autopsy was able to clear that up. It was obvious that the boy had been held somewhere, raped, tortured and drugged over an extended period before eventually succumbing to his injuries. Cause of death was determined to be massive blood loss caused by anal trauma. This had been caused by the insertion of a blunt object, possibly a beer bottle. The victim had also suffered bruising and injuries on his head and back, likely to have been caused by blows delivered by his killer. Traces of 4 drugs were found in his system, including Mandrax and Noctec. The drugs, as it turned out, provided the police with an early breakthrough. While sifting through prescriptions issued for the various medications, they came across the name BEVAN von EINEM. Von EINEM was well known to the Adelaide police. He'd previously been questioned regarding the murders of 3 young men. The circumstances of those deaths were remarkably similar to that of Richard Kelvin. 4 days after the body was discovered, von EINEM was pulled in for questioning. He denied any involvement in the murder, saying that he'd been in bed with the flu on the night Richard Kelvin was abducted. His mother would back up his story, he said. In addition, he would provide blood and hair samples as well as carpets and other items from his home for the police to test. Von EINEM's willingness to cooperate surprised investigators, making them wonder if they had the right man. But a search of von EINEM's house and subsequent forensic tests on the items found put the investigation right back on track. Firstly, there were the drugs, bottles of Mandrax and Noctec, which von EINEM had obtained by visiting a number of different doctors. Then there were hairs and fibres found on Richard Kelvin's body and clothing, hairs that matched von EINEM, fibres that matched the carpets in his home. The case was strengthened further when a former associate of von EINEM, a man referred to in police records only as Mr. B, came forward. He described in great detail how he and von EINEM would cruise for young male hitchhikers, ply them with drug-laced drinks, and then drive them to von EINEM's Campbelltown home. There the men would be raped and sexually abused overnight before being released the next day. The police now believed they had enough evidence against von EINEM, and he was arrested and charged with Richard Kelvin's murder on November 3rd, 1983. The committal hearing was set for February 20th, 1984. By then, von EINEM must have realised that he needed to explain away the forensic evidence, so he concocted a new story. He now claimed that he'd met Richard Kelvin on O'Connell Street and Richard had willingly gotten into his car. They had driven to von EINEM's house, where they spoke for a while about the problems Richard was having at school and about his bisexual inclinations. 2 hours later, von EINEM dropped Richard off in the Adelaide CBD, giving him $20 to take a cab home. Richard was alive and well when they parted company, he claimed. The story was frankly ridiculous, and rather than help von Einem's case, probably contributed to his indictment for murder. The court date was set for October 15, 1984. Von Einem pleaded not guilty at trial, and having concocted his story at the committal, had little choice but to stick with it. His defence team even extrapolated on the narrative, suggesting that someone else had abducted Richard after von Einem dropped him off. The story was given short shrift by the jury. They took just 7.5 hours to convict. The judge then sentenced Bevan von Einem to life in prison, stipulating that he must serve at least 24 years before becoming eligible for parole. With von Einem now safely behind bars, the police began looking into 4 unsolved cases, in which the MO closely matched the Kelvin murder. Between 1979 and 1982, 4 young men, Alan Barnes, Neil Muir, Peter Stogneff and Mark Langley, had been abducted, raped and murdered. Von Einem had been the prime suspect, and rumours had been rife about a sinister group of homosexual child abusers named The Family, who were supposedly behind the killings. The group was said to include some of the elite of Adelaide society, including doctors, lawyers, judges and politicians. At the time, prosecutors did not have sufficient evidence to proceed with a murder trial. Now they believed that they did, provided they could enter evidence from the Kelvin trial to establish MO. On September 15, 1989, Bevan von Einem was arrested in his cell at Yatala Labour Prison and charged with the murder of Alan Barnes. On November 10th, another charge was added for the death of Mark Langley. Unfortunately, von Einem would never stand trial for the Barnes and Langley murders. After a judge ruled evidence from the Kelvin trial inadmissible, there was just no way to proceed successfully with the prosecution, and all charges were dropped. Prosecutors and police alike remain convinced that von Einem was responsible for the murders and several others besides. Bevan von Einem is currently serving his time at Port Augusta Prison. There he continues to offend, having been accused of raping a fellow inmate and having been caught in possession of child pornography. He will be eligible for parole in 2020.